Most people can tell you what they want. Far fewer can tell you what is actually good. And fewer still can explain why whole societies can become brilliant, wealthy, organized, and yet still decay from the inside. That is the problem Bernard Lonergan takes up in Chapter 2 of Method in Theology. Because once you have said, in Chapter 1, that human consciousness moves from experience to understanding, from understanding to judgment, from judgment to decision, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Decision for what? Judgment about what good? Responsibility ordered toward what end? And Lonergan's answer is severe and concrete. The good is never an abstraction. The good is always concrete. That is where he begins. He says that if one tries simply to define the good, one risks misleading the reader. So instead of giving a neat formula, he assembles the components that enter into the human good: skills, feelings, values, beliefs, cooperation, progress, decline. That is what this episode is about. Not morality as a list of rules, not ethics as private preference, but the human good as a structure of persons, actions, institutions, feelings, judgments, and history. And if we get this wrong, theology itself goes wrong, because theology does not speak to angels, it speaks to human beings living in cultures, making judgments, building institutions, rising toward the good or collapsing into decline. So Lonergan begins with something surprisingly humble. He begins with skill. Now, that may sound too basic for a chapter on the good, but it is essential. He draws on Piaget and says that the acquisition of a skill involves adaptation to new objects and situations. In each adaptation, there is assimilation and adjustment. Assimilation uses already learned operations. Adjustment modifies and supplements them through trial and error. And this process continues. Operations differentiate, combinations multiply, and the child gradually develops more and more complex capacities. Skill, then, obviously is not magic. It's the slowly won mastery by which a person can move completely in the world. So, why start there, though? Well, because the human good is not wished into existence. It is enacted through developed capacities. You cannot have a good family, a good polity, a good economy, a good church without people who can actually do things. You need trained capacities. You need learned operations. You need mastery. And Lonergan adds an idea that is especially important for the whole book. He speaks of mediation. Some operations are immediate. You see what is present. You hear what is sounding. You touch what is there. And through imagination, language, and symbols, human beings operate mediately. We can deal with what is absent, past, future, possible, ideal, even fantastic. In this way, the child moves from the immediate world of the nursery into the larger world mediated by meaning. And that matters. That matters because the good for human beings is never confined to immediate satisfactions. We do not live only by what is right in front of us. We live by memories, by promises, institutions, laws, symbols, teachings, expectations, ideals. Human good is already a mediated good. And that leads directly to Lonergan's second component, feelings. Here he makes a distinction that many moral theories miss. Not all feelings are alike. Some are non-intentional states and trends. Fatigue, irritability, hunger, thirst. These have causes or goals, but they do not yet involve a meaningful apprehension of an object. Other feelings are intentional responses. These arise in relation to what is apprehended, represented, understood. These are not just inner weather. They are ways in which we are dynamically oriented in a world mediated by meaning. Things like joy, sorrow, hope, fear, love, hatred, trust, distrust, reverence, indignation, tenderness, wrath. These, Lonergan says, give consciousness its mass, its momentum, drive, and power. Without them, our knowing and deciding would be paper thin. That is perhaps one of the most important corrections Lonergan offers. Reason is not erased by feeling, but neither is feeling some embarrassing residue to be cleared away so that pure reason can operate. Feeling is part of our orientation toward the world. And yet he is careful here also. Feeling can be responses either to what is merely agreeable or disagreeable, satisfying or dissatisfying, or to genuine values. Those are not the same thing. What is agreeable may be truly good, but what is truly good may also be difficult and painful and demanding and initially unwelcome. That is one of Lonergan's great anti-sentimental points. If you reduce the good to the agreeable, you will be corrupted by comfort. If you reduce value to preference, you will never understand sacrifice, duty, courage, fidelity, or holiness. So he introduces a scale of values: vital values, social values, cultural values, personal values, religious values. Vital values concern health and strength and vigor. Social values concern the good of order for a community. Cultural values concern meaning and truth and beauty, intelligence, the symbols and practices through which a people lives more than merely animal life. Personal value concerns the person himself and self-transcendence, in loving and being loved, and becoming an originator of value. And religious value, he says, is at the heart of the meaning and value of human life and human world. So already you can see why theology needs this chapter, because if there is no hierarchy of values, then theology gets flattened to therapy and politics or private consolation. And if feeling is denied any role in moral life, then theology becomes bloodless, a system without force. But Lonergan doesn't stop at feelings. He turns to the notion of value itself. And here he says something exact and profound. Value is a transcendental notion. That means value is what is intended in questions for deliberation, just as the intelligible is intended in questions for intelligence, and truth and being are intended in questions for reflection. In plain language, when you ask whether something is truly good or merely apparently good, whether something is really worth doing, whether a course of action ought to be chosen, you are already intending value even before you possess it. And again, he insists that value is concrete. The good is never some vague abstraction floating above life. Only the concrete is good, and because the transcendental notion of the good keeps pressing us onward, criticizing every finite achievement, exposing every flawed perfection, we are never fully at rest in partial goods. The good calls us beyond complacency. It settles us. It unforces us to ask the question of whether what we are doing is truly worthwhile. This is where self-transcendence enters again. To know the intelligible, to know the true, to know the real and then to choose the genuinely good is the unfolding of human intentionality into fuller and fuller transcendence. But he doesn't stop there. Lonergan here makes a further distinction. There is apprehension of value and there is judgment of value. We can feel the pull of something noble, beautiful, true, admirable. That is apprehension. But judgment of value is more than that. A judgment of value says that this is truly good or merely apparently good. It may compare goods and say that one is better, more urgent, more important than another. And such judgments are objective or merely subjective, depending on whether they proceed from a self-transcending subject or not. And that is crucial. Lonergan is not saying value is subjective because people make judgments. He is saying judgments of value are objective when they arise from authenticity, from the subject's real self-transcendence. And this is why judgments matter. In judgments of value, the criterion is heading towards moral self-transcendence. In both cases, the judgment claims something independent of the subject. Fact claims what is or is not so. Value claims what is or is not of value. Knowledge of reality, especially human reality, intentional responses to value, and the initial thrust towards moral self-transcendence constituted by the judgment itself. This is one of the most useful passages in the whole book, because it explains why moral seriousness requires more than good intentions. If knowledge is deficient, then fine feelings become what he calls moral idealism, lovely proposals that do not work out and often do more harm than good. And that is devastatingly accurate. It is possible to feel warmly, speak nobly, and still act stupidly. The cure is not cynicism. The cure is the integration of accurate knowledge, cultivated feelings, and authentic judgment. And then Lonergan adds a point that really does cut deep. The development of moral knowledge and moral feelings heads towards an existential discovery. You come to realize that when you choose between courses of action, you are not only choosing what to do, you are choosing what kind of person you are becoming. That is why he says judgments of value are the door to one's fulfillment or one's loss. And that should slow us down, because modern people often imagine freedom as open options. Lonergan understands freedom more severely. Freedom is not protected by keeping all commitments provisional. Freedom is exercised in self-determination. Every serious choice shapes the chooser. Now, before he builds the full structure of the human good, Lonergan includes a section on belief. And that's not digression. It is one of the most realistic things in the chapter. He says that most of what any civilized person knows is not immanently generated by his own direct experience, insight, and judgment. Human knowledge is social and historical. It is the common fund from which each draws by believing, and which each contributes by performing cognitional operations properly and reporting results accurately. Without belief, every generation would have to begin again from near primitivism. That matters for theology in an obvious way. No one invents a tradition from scratch. We inherit language and texts and doctrines and liturgies, arguments, memories, authorities, habits of trust, climates of opinion. Belief is not the enemy of intelligence. Credulity is not the enemy of intelligence. Blindness is the enemy of intelligence. But critically responsible belief is one of the conditions of civilization itself. And now Lonergan brings everything together in one of the central moves of the chapter. He says the human good is at once individual and social. Then he lays out the structure using a set of interlocking terms: capacity and need, cooperation, operation, particular good, plasticity, development, institution, good of order, liberty, orientation, personal relations, terminal value. What does this mean? At the most basic level, individuals have capacities for operating. By operating, they procure instances of the particular good, meaning any object or action that meets a need of a particular person at a given place and time. Food for this hungry person, shelter for this family, a book for this student, medicine for this patient. But human beings do not live as isolated operators. To a notable extent, their operating is cooperating. It follows a pattern fixed by roles and tasks within institutional frameworks: family, education, state, law, economy, technology, church. These are the structures within which cooperation becomes stable, and then at this point comes one of Lonergan's key ideas: the good of order. This is not the same as particular goods. It is the concrete manner in which cooperation is actually worked out. Not just my dinner tonight, but a social order in which dinner regularly reaches those who must eat. Not just my education, but an educational order in which formation is actually available and functioning. So that means the good of order is not utopia. It is not a blueprint. It is the actually functioning network of relations that sustains the recurrent provision of particular goods. This is an extraordinarily useful distinction because societies often obsess over isolated goods while neglecting the order that makes their recurrence possible. Or else they fetishize the system while forgetting the person it ought to serve. Lonergan will not let you choose between the two. The human good requires both, particular goods and good of order, persons and institutions, freedom and cooperation. And then he pushes further. Liberty, he says, is self-determination, and when the self regularly opts not for the merely apparent good, but for the true good, it achieves moral self-transcendence and constitutes itself as an originating value. The goods chosen then become terminal values, true instances of the particular good. A true good of order, a true scale of preferences. That distinction between originating and terminal values is decisive. Originating values are persons in their authenticity choosing well. Terminal values are the goods brought about through those choices. And ideally, these overlap and interface. A good person helps bring about a genuinely good world. Not perfectly, but really. And then Lonergan adds personal relations. A community is not just a mechanism. It is alive with feeling, common experience, common or opposed judgments, mutual commitment or hostility. Personal relations range from intimacy to ignorance, from love to exploitation, from respect to contempt, from friendliness to enmity. These relationships bind the community together, divide it into factions, or tear it asunder. So the human good is not just a moral theory, it is a structure of living. It is the interaction of skills, feelings, belief, institutions, liberty, judgment, and relation. And all of this leads to the final movement of the chapter, progress and decline. Lonergan says progress proceeds from originating value, from subjects being their true selves by observing the transcendental precepts: be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, be responsible. Progress happens when those are brought to bear on actual human affairs. Attention notices what is really going on. Intelligence grasps unrealized possibilities. Reason judges what probably will and will not work. Responsibility evaluates short and long-term costs and benefits for self, group, and others. And because situations change, these operations must be exercised again and again. Progress is continuous flow, not a single triumph. But that same structure makes decline possible, because attention can fail, intelligence can become obtuse, reason can be bent by rationalization, responsibility can be corrupted by egoism, group loyalty, hostility, and short-term appetite. Then the process of cumulative improvement becomes cumulative distortion. The good of order deteriorates. Law becomes compromised. Group egoism rationalizes itself. Ideology grows up to justify blindness. And eventually, as Lonergan says with remarkable force, a civilization in decline digs its own grave with relentless consistency. That is one of the bleakest and truest lines in the entire book, because decline is not just external defeat, it is internal corruption. Not simply that bad things happen to a people, but that a people becomes unable to judge clearly enough, to act responsibly enough to correct itself. This is why he says the basic form of alienation is disregard for the transcendental precepts, and the basic form of ideology is the doctrine that justifies such disregard. A self-transcendence promotes progress. Refusal of self-transcendence turns progress into cumulative decline. And then, at the end of the chapter, theology quietly returns. Lonergan says that a religion which promotes self-transcendence to the point not merely of justice, but of self-sacrificing love will have a redemptive role in human society, because such love can undo the mischief of decline and restore the cumulative process of progress. That is the hinge. Why theology needs an account of the human good, because theology does not address merely isolated souls, it addresses persons in history, communities in conflict, cultures rising or decaying, institutions serving or failing the good, judgments becoming authentic or ideological. Without an account of the human good, theology cannot explain what grace heals, what sin damages, what conversion reorders, or what redemption restores. So let me close the episode simply. Lonergan's account of the good is demanding because it refuses every shortcut. The good is not what I happen to want. It is not what feels nice. It is not whatever my group approves of. The good is concrete. It requires trained capacities. It requires rightly ordered feeling. It requires sound judgment. It requires institutions that sustain cooperation. It requires persons who become originating values by choosing the truly good. And it requires vigilance, because progress is fragile and decline is cumulative. That is why this chapter matters, because theology that cannot speak about values, cooperation, institutions, progress, and decline will end up speaking beautifully about salvation while saying almost nothing intelligible about actual human life. In the next episode, we move to meaning. Because once Lonergan has shown that human good is social, historical, effective, and structured, the next question follows naturally. How is the world actually mediated? How do symbols, language, art, and culture carry the meanings by which human beings live?